Hello, and welcome to Artfield Answers podcast. This is our 6th episode, and I'm welcomed today by Mike Greenberg, seated at my right. And we go back to the first years of my career working in public art, which at the time I was told was design enhancement only. And we have gotten to know each other because of assignments or things that the Office of Cultural Affairs or Public Works were reaching out to you for stories. But I know you know all of this, but for a lot of the viewers and listeners, what you would gather from today's reception to public art in terms of media, in terms of leadership, business leadership, it was a very different environment just 20 years ago, 25 years ago.
Mm.
And as we were talking, the public art ordinance that first got all this started was right around 30 years ago. And in doing this podcast project, I've been focusing on art advocacy, how we could bring some fresh curiosity to the arts and community scene. I was a little nostalgic for the days in which people cared to honestly discuss the merits of public art and policy, because I think nowadays we're happy to remain ignorant about what do the policies exactly say and what is the purpose of transparency in that process. But paint a picture, if you would, to what was going on in the kind of the heightened Jesse Helms period that was really criticizing art, reception of society to arts and contemporary art, but also back home when we're dealing with a city council that has moved to a 10 district, one mayor environment. And how would you sum up that time period?
There were two major controversies that stand out during my time at the Express News. One was the public art proposal, in which some of the council, one of the ordinance identified several genres that could be funded. One of which was fireworks, works for fire, and of course, several of the council members thought that meant fireworks trying to explode. I thought, well, that's dumb, So there was a lot of ignorance back then. There was a lot of just conservative dislike of spending money on art that should be spent on potholes. So, yeah, it was troublesome for a while, but I think we really kind of overcome that. I don't see that much opposition now, unless I've just not been paying attention.
The popularity of art can start to work against artistic merit, quality over quantity. I think for a good time, the onus was on the arts community to show the merits of such a program and a policy. And that, I would say, took 10 years, maybe longer, to have enough projects go from start to finish that you began to get the confidence that would allow really good projects. Looking at where we are, I feel like we were more in search of a path than we are today. I'll use the example because I've got kids that love games. A lot of the games wander. Like they go in, they create an environment and they wander. There isn't much of a quest specifically going on, as opposed to something that requires greater efforts. I would say there isn't so much the clamor about support for public art, but it also seems to me like the community is a little less interested in the details, which is to me kind of a shame.
Well, I don't know. It seems to me that think people are really glad to see it. There's a lot of it around San Antonio neighborhoods, and I haven't heard anybody in my neighborhood complain about. I live near Woodland Lake.
Yeah.
There's some nice pieces there. I think people, the the two, I guess they're obelisks or something at the corner of Blanco Road and is it Almonds Drive, sort of covered in tile, sort of making a sort of a grand entrance to
Is it Blanco and Bassi?
Blanco and Bessie. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. People like that. They're proud of it.
And no, yeah, that was one of my projects. And I guess I would say that, yes, that was done by, late great Angel
Yeah.
Rodriguez Diaz. And when you look at the progress of an artist who's primarily known as a painter from Puerto Rico, come into San Antonio, get a name for himself, really be interested in how to contribute to society, like be a civic member
Mm-hmm.
of the society by being an artist. He went through multiple projects in which he worked on the One Stop Center, in which he did a mural, and he worked with the architects to do entryway projects. Then went on to do the beacon at Blanco and Fulton, which was a metal sculpture, and then the crossroads of enlightenment there at Bassi and Blanco, and those are two pieces on either side. It was kind of an ode to Cementville, as well as to celebrate that part of Blanco, which was pretty much an auto parts mom and pops stores, and give us some more pride and significance. So the maturity that and the learning that was happening over those three projects allowed Sunhill to do something quite amazing. I just wanted, before we get into some of our questions, to ask, in your experience, what was that like being a kind of target for a lot of this public discussion, pro or con a particular public art project or a particular happening? I just was going through a newspapers.com site and searching your name for just, I like to do research all the time, really, but there's just letters to the editors that would just be a full mid-size section dedicated to Mike Greenberg, and
That didn't happen very often.
it didn't happen very often,
No.
but it did happen. Over the years, it happened.
Sure.
We've moved beyond having columnists or writers in almost any of our, whether it's a newspaper, whether it's an online, it's just not happening. In fact, even no comments are allowed on most platforms these days. So but you really heard loud and clear
Sure.
a lot of that. I mean, just it suited your nature, but I would be anxious as all get out.
Oh, it really didn't bother me at all. I felt, my job was reasonably secure until things really went nosedived in the newspaper industry. And, the arts people were the first to go, usually. I really didn't think about it all that much, frankly.
Maybe that means your personality was well suited. I mean, and it comes back from the fact that you're a well-trained journalist. You understood what your role was. You weren't necessarily, I think you probably came into it thick-skinned. I admired how much you were willing to say everything that you had to say, and you said it very well in a number of different topics. But it's also kind of unique now, because I really don't know how many people are developing their own voice as much as was happening over the past 25 or 50 years in reporting on local news and stories.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons is that with declining advertising revenue and declining readership, obviously, the amount of money that newspapers have to spend is a lot lower, and they'd rather, for good reason, put that money into straight reporting. You got to tell people what is happening before you tell them your opinion about it. So that's understandable. It's a shame. the gap, at least in news, is being filled pretty nicely by nonprofits, the Texas Tribune, things like that, San Antonio Report.
I've been frustrated by the news, in particular, the sections that they will categorize as arts are almost 99% nothing to do with arts. It might be upcoming stand-up comedy show. Basically, it's an ad to get people to come to the comedy show, or it could be something that has to do with the environment or parks. Like I was just a really great article was coming out in the Current this week, and the category was arts, but it was really it had nothing to do with arts. It was really about parks and environment and maintenance. And that's the other byproduct is just that we've really kind of gotten more and more fuzzy about how to talk about art and how to bring attention and community interest to art without it necessarily being entertainment, and the idea of entertaining ourselves to death by just having lots of pretty looking things, but we don't really maybe even connect to some of the ideas or some of the importance that the artist might be seeking to serve, especially from their community. I
want to mention
Please.
the other big controversy in that period concerned city funding for the Esperanza Center.
Right.
It had been approved for a sizable grant by the Arts and Cultural Advisory Committee. City Council did not like that organization for a number of reasons. They just didn't think it was really doing art. Well, it was doing other things too. So the city zeroed it out, went to court. I think it might have been Hippo Garcia, but I'm not sure. Federal judge overturned the canceling out of that grant because it violated First Amendment. It was viewpoint discrimination. That was, I think that payback to the city for ending that grant, I think that may have helped move things in a better direction. They got slapped and they realized, oh, we can't really do this. So that helped. I want to mention one other thing. I don't remember when the main library was built. I think early 90s, maybe.
They began the design competition maybe in the late early 90s, but I think it was finished in the early
90s. Yeah. I was writing about architecture back then and throughout the 80s. And one thing that really disturbed me was that the city had a process for selecting architecture firms. And it was a sort of check the box thing. And there was no box for artistic acumen, architectural design acumen. It was strictly, or can they get things done on time and stuff like that. And then Marie Swartz, who was the chairman of the library board, insisted on doing this national competition. And the popularity of that building when it opened, I think really opened a lot of eyes in the political leadership, realizing that, aesthetics do matter. And the quality of civic architecture in San Antonio really shot up after that. We've had a lot of really, really fine buildings. So some credit has to go to that also.
I definitely agree. I've been researching separately from these interviews as to go back and create a comprehensive matrix or a timeline that understands how ideas were set into motion. What was the effort like to get those things to materialize? Were some of the sentiments of the public being for it or against it? Looking at the timeline where you can see what else was happening at the city. Are we prepared to educate a new audience on the history of local art and in real accurate terms of why things happened the way they did?
Well, the baseline is so much different from what it was in the 80s and early 90s. I think a new cultural plan, understanding that we're going from a much higher level, starting at a much higher level. I also wrote, in addition to writing about the arts, this is one of the arts, I wrote about urban design and urbanism, I guess you could say. And one of the, it's almost unbelievable now that in the 1980s, there was some agitation for wider sidewalks that people could actually use, for bicycle lanes. And you're ride a bicycle in San Antonio. Look at the streets now. Nobody wants to walk in San Antonio. It's just a totally different city from that time.
I think, and it's probably generational too. People who thought that they knew better and were wiser. Maybe the younger generation of those that followed in their footsteps don't want to necessarily be so out of step with what they're observing happening in other metropolitan areas. The question is, for where we are and what we've accomplished, what would serve us today? Just give a quick introduction to how you came to make San Antonio your residence.
Well, I was born here, so I didn't have a choice.
That was easy.
After high school at Elm Heights, I went to McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota, a very liberal institution, a very internationalistic. They had something called the World Press Institute, where journalists from a bunch of other countries were in residence at McAllister. One of my professors was Hubert Humphrey. So, yeah, it was a very good experience and in a lot of ways, terrific arts program also. My first professional job in journalism was at Chicago Magazine, which had a pervasive artistic culture. I should say, before I got that job at Chicago Magazine, when I really needed a job in order to be able to pay my rent and eat, I got a job for the Christmas season as selling shirts in the bargain basement of Marshall Fields on State Street, which wasn't a great job, but I had some good people working around me. My immediate supervisor was an artist himself, and he was also a friend of Ed Paschke. So, a major artist. Actually, I went to a party in Ed Paschke's apartment while I was, this nobody ribbon clerk at Marshall Fields. So it really was pervasive.
That's the way you felt at the time.
Well, yeah. So anyway, then Chicago Magazine, where there was a lot of art in the magazine, writing about art. My boss, it was also the most feared, the editor of Chicago. It was also the most feared dining critic in Chicago. Was also a photography enthusiast, and we had a section of the magazine, a monthly feature called the Guides Gallery. Originally, the magazine was called Chicago Guide, and we gave 6 or 8 pages to a single photographer, a Chicago photographer. And a lot of times I was in charge of selecting that photographer. My boss said, well, if you're going to be doing this, you really need to know something about photography. So he insisted that I get a camera and start using it, which I did. Yeah, there you go. I should say the magazine was owned at the time by WFMT Radio, which is the classical radio station.
Okay.
Commercial radio station owned by the public television station. So that was another reason why there was a lot of art talk.
Well, that's similarly, like when I brought up the artist origin. You can answer this however you might want to, but I know you mentioned that I think it was your grandfather's background, and then as well, where did this appreciation for music began? Origin of this question is, when did that light switch turn on and stay on that connected you to the arts?
Well, there's several different starting points depending on the genre. I got turned on to classical music. I guess it was in elementary school when class was taken to the municipal auditorium for a performance of Scheherazade, the ballet, with the San Antonio Symphony, the PIP, playing the score. And, this music is so lush and luxurious and washing over me. I've got to hear this again. I've got to hear more of this stuff. My older brother was in the Navy, involved in purchasing supplies for battleship and aircraft carrier. He happened to bring back a collection of about 75 or 80 long-playing records that he bought in Brazil. So all the liner notes were in Portuguese. But these were about 2/3 of them were classical and about a third were jazz. So, early Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, a bunch of those guys. But also some major classical artists and works. And one of those LPs was Stravinsky himself conducting the Petrushka suite in The Rite of Spring, his own major works. And The Rite of Spring just blew me away. This was not like any music I had ever heard. It was weird. It was violent. It was ugly sometimes. It was so exciting. So that turned me onto the modernist movement in music. Chicago, I think, turned me on to the modernist movement in visual arts. Great architecture in Chicago, so that was the basis of my writing about architecture. Great neighborhoods.
I remember reading something that said, your photography could be described as street photography in that genre, maybe. But some of them, at least the article I'm quoting, whatever, you were talking about how there was a lot of people in Chicago that activated the opportunity to take photographs. In San Antonio, there wasn't a lot of people out on the street.
That was true back then, yeah.
There's a quietness to the photography that you've been doing. There's a beauty to that. I see it as a very interrelated to sensibilities of music and grandness, to things of nature and light and dark, and the man-made element, the urban element.
Well, one reason I'm doing very little street photography or people photography in general is that, back when I started doing photography in the 70s, you could do street photography and nobody cared. Now you do street photography and people challenge you, they threaten to kill you. It's just gotten difficult. But the other thing is, just my aesthetic sensibilities turn more towards abstraction. A lot of times I really prefer to take photographs that don't have any people in them. And I'm looking at the abstract qualities of form and color, usually not color, usually black and white, light and shadow. And so that's the direction.
Very cinematic.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan. It opened up something for me to see your photography outside of just seeing a name under a photo next to your copy, knowing that he's taking his own photographs. I knew there was something deeper there. I feel like there's an encyclopedia of music and history and all these things in your brain that is personal to you. Well,
it's not an encyclopedia in my brain. It's an ability to use the encyclopedia out in the world. including especially the internet, and which virtually everything is available.
I think maybe I'm trying to say you have very admirable pursuit of information, not taking shortcuts. I mean, you can't be an appreciator of classical music and a lot of these things, and at the same time be a person that feels that taking the shortcuts are much of an asset.
Mhm.
So if there's anyone in particular, family or educators or colleagues that played a big role as far as mentoring you or being an influence that kept you guided?
Gee,
I'm sure there were.
I think I mentioned them before. My boss at Chicago Magazine,
Could you give me his name?
Alan Kelson was his name. He died several years ago. We when I interviewed with him for the job, even at that first interview, we were finishing each other's sentences. There was that kind of uh, connection.
Right. I should have said connection right there.
Well,
Would have been a perfect way for me to finish your sentence.
whatever. You know, he certainly put me on the right road in terms of editing, in terms of working with writers, in terms of my own writing. I did a fair amount of writing and as well as editing. So he was a big influence.
How did you come to interview and get hired by Chicago? I mean, this San Antonio kid.
Well, after college,
I guess your education
well,
really was
hardly.
grabbed people's attention.
After college, I got accepted to the Medill School of Journalism for graduate studies in journalism. Since I hadn't really had much background in journalism in college, I had to go through their summer introductory program, which I did. And then when it was time to register for the fall semester, I realized that I would have to present my college transcript, and I hadn't actually graduated. So I couldn't really get a scholarship. But that's why I ended up working at Marshall Fields. And it's funny how life works. It was just a series of very weird coincidences. One day when I was working at Fields, one of my college friends happened to walk in, and hi. He was working at another department store down the street called Weebles, and he said, they're going to be looking for somebody in the advertising department. And I thought, well, advertising is more towards my interest. So I applied there. I got hired. It was basically pushing a mail cart in the advertising department. But one thing that happened there is that every Monday, or really every day, we'd get the newspapers and I'd have to cut out the Weebolt's ads and paste them into a notebook. So I had to look through all the ads, and I happened to see an ad for a magazine that was hiring an editor. And I thought, oh, maybe that's Chicago Magazine. So I applied for a job there. And it turned out that they hadn't placed the ad, but they were looking for an editor because their existing managing editor was pregnant and she would have to leave at the end of the year. So they were looking for somebody to replace her. So that's how I ended up doing that. It was very weird. And by the way, I really think that pure dumb luck has probably more to do with anybody's success or difficulties either way than almost anything else. It depends on what your genes are from your family, where you were born, what the city is that you live in. There's so much that depends on luck and chance. So I tend not to be extremely braggadocious about my own abilities.
Well, and at the same time, if you look at life that way, you're not too surprised when some kind of synchronicity happens and
Sure.
you realize, no,
Mhm.
of course, let's just let's not stop everything now that you recognize it, but
Mhm.
just dive into it, lean into it. We kind of talked about it already in the trials and tribulations category. I know that you were highlighting the fact that there were trials and tribulations going on within the arts, but was there anything that you wanted to speak to in particular that rose above the others? I mean, you said previously that covering that didn't necessarily make you feel a part of it. Like you didn't take it like these conversations were about something. They
Yeah.
weren't necessarily something that to be taken in personally.
Mhm.
I always had a harder time with that because the more heightened the rhetoric gets, it made me very cognizant when artists and people in our community are put under such stressful conditions.
Mhm.
Um, I'm curious, did you feel that your role was to try to champion a particular cause? In this point in time, it's either the story seems to be already baked to necessarily have a specific political spin, or it just doesn't really tell you anything at all.
Mhm.
And was it just your kind of inherent view as a writer and a journalist that had you writing in defense sometimes of the artistic quest and responding to leaders or politicians that didn't quite get it? In the face of trials and tribulations, did you feel like you had a particular role to play?
Well, there were, a few principles that animated me. In particular, I often wrote about First Amendment issues. The Esperanza situation was certainly one of those. I wrote a column about the about that issue, saying that there was no way that we're going to lose. The city would lose. Esperanza would win that case, and it was very obvious to me that that would happen. That column was actually killed. I wasn't really clear why. I think they said, there were too many other stories about that issue. But shortly after that, the Express News launched a separate arts section. Previously, the arts had been part of the feature section. They broke that out in I guess 2000, 2001.
Was it the Culturis?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And to announce that to the arts community, they had a big reception and explained what was happening. And they had a mock-up of what the new section would look like. And of course, part of that mock-up was my column. Well, what column in particular do you think they used on there? The very one they killed. So people were kind of confused. I don't remember seeing that. There were times when it became a little difficult for me, but for the most part, things were fine over there. I just did my thing.
Sounds like they understood where you were coming from.
Oh yeah,
They weren't necessarily surprised by what you had to say. You had the support of your editors and colleagues, I imagine. Did you get along very much with Roddy Stinson?
that was a fraught relationship. I mean, he was a nice guy. We were on good terms for the most part, but there was something in particular he wrote about. Uh, I think the selection of architects for a fire station, and he just didn't understand what the process was or why things were done, and it was just inaccurate. It was really a bad call, and I responded to it without mentioning his name. But that was the only really serious clash we had. But I mean, he wasn't really in favor of arts program at the city. Because he was sort of MAGA, but not nearly that bad.
I always got the impression that once the Good Government League and the business leaders could no longer put their elected officials out there and going to now break things up into districts, aren't those same business leaders out there that at this point no longer have the influence and role they have getting people elected or and having favors done? sometimes I felt when I would read Roddy's column that these seem almost as if it's a knee-jerk reaction that he had to write things a certain way because they were kind of like a dog whistle.
Hmm.
Like there are certain people out there with viewpoints that he was baiting them to read this just to rile them up, to sell newspapers,
Mhm.
but also to keep that message right there on page 2 about certain topics that the old timers disagreed with.
I think he was pretty much always speaking for himself.
Good.
Yeah, we certainly disagreed on a lot of things, but I never got the impression that he was responding to pressure in any way. And he was popular enough and secure enough that he didn't have to worry.
Well, that solves that. Let's take music. Let's take music rather than visual art. Because I asked this question before about artist values. And for someone who has a cultural intellect, to have a critical mind, people would expect in the community, lay people or people with maybe very little exposure or access, that someone who is learned to be able to tell them what's the difference between good art and bad art. Most of the people, when I ask this question, they almost prefer not to speak about what they don't like and not spend the energy on explaining to people why they don't like something.
Yeah, well, some performances or some works are just not worth writing about. They're not interesting. They're not important. They don't add anything to the cultural dialogue. When I when I reviewed music, people may not realize this, but there were very few statements of opinion in my reviews. Mostly I was telling people what it was, what happened. And when I'm sitting in a concert, I sort of pay attention to my visceral reaction to what's happening. If my reaction is really excited, or I'm really paying attention, I'm transported to another world. But then I ask, okay, what is going on in that performance that makes me feel this way? So I can try to tell the reader something about that. And conversely, if I'm really bored, I could ask what is going on in the performance that is boring me. So, that's something else to write about. In general, I didn't write about things I just plain didn't like. There was one case, not in music, but in architecture. There was a building a medical building that was being proposed and was actually built. Had an advertisement in the Express News showing a big drawing of this building, and it was just awful. It was actually it's there. You can see it. It's near Market Square. It's up against the freeway, the elevated freeway. There's a garage on the bottom, and like 6 or 8 floors of medical offices above. And I wrote a pretty damning column about it, just about the illustration. Developer, who was also an architect, was based in Houston. He was upset with me, and
You didn't really sell the project.
and now I can't remember if he actually called me or wrote me a letter or something, but I have a feeling he actually made it even worse just to get back at me. It actually looked better in the drawing than the final product. So yeah, I generally don't write about a lot of things that just I don't like or that are bad.
You don't want to pour fuel on the fire.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes it's necessary though.
When we look at the art field today, as we've talked about, made a lot of progress, a lot of gains. Would any of these 5 things rank particularly high in your mind as far as being a big part of the solution: economics, education, access, aesthetic merit, and community interest. I've kind of designed this as a question that obviously all five are suitable.
Yeah. I wouldn't know how to rank them. Um, Obviously, you have to be able to afford to do it, so economics are important. Well, I really would not be able to rank them. That's all of the above. Well, yeah. Right now, I'm working on a potential book about uh, really the ongoing, evolving relationship between people and water in San Antonio. Water is kind of an important thing here. And one of partly I'm writing about the mission reach of the San Antonio River, which is a fabulous project. It's a wonderful project, and very popular. People love it. Uh, and for that project, for any successful project, it depends on it depends on biologists, it depends on all kinds of scientists, it depends on engineers, it depends on community leaders, depends on accountants. It's virtually every aspect of society is behind the success of or failure of a big project like that. So I don't think you can really isolate any one of those. It has to be all of them. When the speaking of the mission reach, the Army Corps of Engineers had designed, if you can use that word, the original flood control projects from the late 1950s and 60s, which were basically just concrete, a lot of times concrete channels that just gouges across the landscape that eliminated all of the habitat, and there was no beauty. There was nothing there. It was basically a drainage ditch. And 30 years later, they repented and they said, in order for the mission reach to survive, to succeed on environmental grounds, and it has to be supported by the people at large. People have to take ownership of it. So you have to make it attractive. You have to make people want to visit it. There's a balance to be drawn between people visiting and people not disturbing the habitat. You have to deal with that. But, they really sought in a major way to make this a public asset, not just something to move water down the to the learning about the interconnections between the various human aspects of human life. And you really have to understand that they're all connected.
I really like that answer. I agree because it's whether it's economics, education, access, aesthetic merit, no one individual has all of the technical skills and qualifications to just be able to with mastery, move everything forward. You have to have a certain kind of depth of knowledge, a specialization to be able to break down the economic benefits and challenges specific to a particular cause or industry. It takes all of that. And so I definitely do agree. You can't get meaningful change and meaningful progress by just focusing on one. What happens is you do end up getting some initiatives to just focus on a particular area because they really don't have the capacity to do the other part.
Right. I want to say something about one of those, though, and that is artistic merit. That can be a trap. Artistic merit, when people are judging artistic merit, they tend to be judging it in relation to what they already know, the art that exists already or that existed in the past. And using that, it's a really difficult term to pin down. I mean, even if you're hiring people for the accounting department, merit can mean a lot of different things. It can mean your ability to do the work. It could also mean your ability to be imaginative, to have a good relationship with your boss, whatever. There are a lot of different aspects to artistic merit or any kind of merit. As I said, it can be a trap.
That comes across too. Like, imagine, your orchestra, you've got your first chair violinist, technically should be the highest, strongest artistic merit, but that's in that particular genre at that moment in time. Compare that to a jazz club and a improviser, saxophonist or team. That, the, the artistic merit is what probably draws people to those performances, to appreciate those artists, but for completely different reasons. Um, and also based on someone's particular interest. To one man's classical music is just will not necessarily turn on somebody who's solely interested in hearing Coltrane.
Yeah, when
Am I following you a little bit?
yeah, when bop first arrived on the jazz scene, I would expect that people who were used to swing and to traditional New Orleans jazz would hear bop and think, "What the hell was that? That's not music." And then when Miles Davis came along, and the emphasis was on the spaces between the notes, people would say, "No, what the hell is that?" So you have to be open to innovation, and sometimes innovation fails, which is part of its job, and sometimes it succeeds. You have to give it an opportunity to fail or succeed. So anyway, that's my rant on artistic merit.
And masters over their craft are also kind of few and far between.
Sure.
Just because you have the best ambition and intent doesn't necessarily mean your attempt to sound like Miles Davis is going to come anywhere close to what anybody would. But if it sounds good to you, I mean, at the same time, if you're the artist and you're trying to satisfy your own pleasure, that's the thing about art and music. Is sometimes it's about the audience, and sometimes it's about the performer.
That's right.
So I'm going to veer into something that's also somewhat nebulous, but it's a term that I enjoy talking about, which they're calling cultural sincerity. You're a master of all the words that it can be used to describe an arts and culture community in terms of the lexicon of cultural appropriation, cultural sensitivity, cultural this and that. I've never really heard the idea of cultural sincerity, but it does go to a couple of the points. One is AI and the idea that things can be faked and things can be created without actually intellectual dialogue. We're seeing culture be processed by computers and the like based on things that have been done before versus things that are coming from truly creative consciousness. And so it's a unique condition that we're now faced with in this current time, because certainly in the past, over the history of mankind, artists would be the expected leaders for society. The art class would be those that would try to break ground to create what you might call cultural sincerity. And I'm obviously speaking extemporaneously, but I remember thinking that there was a period in art history in where artists began to just depict regular people as opposed to kings and barons or other kind of royalty. And this shift toward just showing common people ushered in a certain enlightenment, and it also spoke to power and those kinds of things. And I wonder, in terms of today, to reassure or reaffirm that cultural sincerity isn't attainable in terms of finding the truth in our community without necessarily an agenda. We're experiencing, this is our agenda with the Super Bowl halftime. It's got Kid Rock on one view, and then you've got Bad Bunny on the Super Bowl. And what might cultural sincerity mean if if it's appropriate?
I really don't know. I'm not familiar with with the term.
I'm
I hadn't heard it
making it
before.
up. Yeah.
Oh, you're making it up. Oh,
Yeah.
that explains it. I don't know. If you mean I think it tends to carry the implication of a reaction against modern irony, against the unreliable narrator.
That's what that kind of that does close in on kind of what I was trying to say.
The thing is, okay, one example of sincerity in visual arts would be, let's say, Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post covers. But some of those were really explosive. He dealt with segregation. He got into some interesting topics. So being sincere and non-ironic does not necessarily mean you can't say something important. So I'm not sure I would. I really have a lot of impatience with most categories, I guess. I'd prefer to, in music, for example, the distinction between classical music and popular music or rock just really fades away. You really have to think in terms of what is this artist actually doing, irrespective of what the genre is. And so, I consider Brian Wilson's songs for the Beach Boys to be among the equal of any classical music of the 20th century. Harmonically, they're amazing. In counterpoint, they're amazing. There are a lot of examples like that where.
So let me jump in on that. The Brian Wilson's music, if just use Pet Sounds for lack of a different album. If somebody the following year makes an obvious knockoff Pet Sounds album and tries to look like Brian Wilson, maybe gets performers and they call himself the Sand Buddies. It's clear if you listen to Pet Sounds and listen to it and see it and understand where it's coming from, that there's some sincerity in that, and there's real obvious insincerity to those that are trying to steal that work and benefit from it, or just feed one's ego or whatever. And that is the big topic, is that it goes a little bit to this idea of, doesn't it matter? Doesn't it matter to be curious and gravitate towards the work that is that sincere artistic effort? It's just, that's where I'm coming from.
Well, I think it would be fairly easy for somebody to prompt an AI composer to manufacture new compositions in the style of Brian Wilson.
Probably already happening.
Yeah, sure. But I guess I tend to think of virtually any art, well, really any art form, period, as a physical process. Holding the brush and painting, dancing, playing an instrument, even writing, especially if you're a typewriter or writing by hand. It is a physical act. I think that's an important aspect of all the arts. It's a making. And in the case of an AI product, nobody's actually making it. There's no physicality to the making of it. And I think young people now want that. I have a mentee. I've been mentoring a kid, son of a friend of mine. He's 17 now, but we started together when he was 15. He's interested in black and white film photography, film. And he's got some amazing photographs too. So, we go out and shoot around San Antonio, but, he likes the imperfection of film, the bits of dust that get on the film. Um, and I think there's young people are taking up film photography now in pretty big numbers. So I think there's a reaction against the the sort of manufactured art. How successful it will be, I don't know.
Right. I'm just going to roll in one more question, and I can probably tell that. Well, I'll give it a two-part question. Is there something that you'd want to say that you feel like you admire about San Antonio's art scene, and perhaps to contrast that with something that you somewhat dislike about San Antonio's art scene?
Gosh, there's so much to like about San Antonio's art scene now. It's so much better than it was when I started working at the Express News. Nine. There's so much diversity, so much churn in the visual arts, especially. There's a lot of interesting music happening here. I don't think there's the problem. A lot of times is just the access to money. I don't think San Antonio has quite the arts philanthropic quantity as that it should have for its population. Look what happened with San Antonio Symphony. Look at the theater uh, uh, community in San Antonio. We don't have really strong. We don't have a strong professional theater. Well, we have the Central Playhouse, but that's pretty much it for professional theater. So, yeah, I think we need more financial support, a lot more financial support. But I think the native talent is definitely here. The symphony, which is no longer in existence, and the San Antonio Philharmonic is trying to fill that role with many of the same musicians who played for the symphony. But gosh, I don't know if they're going to survive. They just don't get enough support. But some of those musicians are amazing. You mentioned the concertmaster. The concertmaster of the symphony, the last one we had, Eric Rotz, just an astonishing musician. He could have a major solo career easily. I'm not sure what he's doing now. I think he might be with another orchestra. I just haven't been able to find him. But there are a lot of great musicians here in many different fields. So there's ferment here. I think because of the cultural landscape here, the cultural makeup of the demographics, the history of putting down the working class, I think, the anti-union history San Antonio has. I think all of these things give San Antonio artists a lot to work with, a lot of friction, a lot of tension to work with. So, I think natively San Antonio is in great shape artistically if we can get some more money into that community.
It wasn't that long ago that the railroads connected San Antonio to the rest of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as people started coming into San Antonio from places that were both European, but also more than likely in the States where there were, like Chicago, they were connected to the water, they were connected to rivers, there were ports, and access. So San Antonio really had to do everything on its own. As soon as its community started to grow, it's like, yeah, we don't have a library. Just like the small towns, Comfort and Fredericksburg, they have these certain things, but that same story was San Antonio. We needed a library. We need to have some sort of literary society. We had a lot of intellectuals that come from people that have experienced something, but they're here now. They have nothing to bring them quality of life, and so they were here for because there must have been some strong opportunity, incentive to be here, but they had to find it within themselves to muster the finances and the efforts. And I guess I wonder now, if we if we can seriously understand what our needs are and not waste money, because I think there is a lot of waste on things that are they're just kind of maintaining the status quo, but they're not necessarily taking us anywhere. Maybe some money would open up, but that's another podcast. Anything lastly, in terms of our local art history, I know that a lot of people that I would have loved to get a recording with, no longer with us. So, you know, I would assume that developing a strong sense of local art history is going to be very important to the future of art in our community. Because who wants to come to an art community in which their own community don't seem to really know about themselves or champion local artists? Any thoughts on our local art history? 101.
Yeah, I haven't made a deep dive into that. Um, there are some interesting, well, part of our art history is things like, when the Whitty Museum used to devote a great deal of space to the fiesta gowns of the duchesses and queens and all that stuff. That was the attic of rich San Antonio. There was a kind of a strange understanding of what art is, I guess. I think there have always been really good artists here in fairly limited numbers, though. The Bluebonnet guy,
Underdog.
yeah, was a pretty talented guy. The Bluebonnet painting genre is sort of put down and is kind of commonplace now, but he knew what he was doing.
What I found interesting, I was looking up Underdog, and then so Underdog was a teacher. One of the great things, these artists of the past, Jose Arpa and others, they were like Mihangos did when he was around. He taught a great number of artists that wanted to be mentored under him. And that was also the same thing with Underdog. Underdog created the first art guild, and the art guild would start to meet. Then Underdog, wasn't getting very far here in San Antonio, and he started to travel to Dallas because he was getting commissions and he was able to get a teaching gigs there. So then he and Eleanor and Julian Underdog all moved to Dallas. Well, then the art guild went away until it came back, and at that point, the art guild had kind of changed to the art league, essentially art league. They've reformed it, but it is important that all these figures, whether they were few and far between, they did get a lot of notice, and they started movements that were more than just about getting their work sold. It was about cultivating a community around the arts. And Underdog was certainly one of those. He was a master at it.
And the whole I wouldn't really call it a genre, but the efflorescence of really fine artists, visual artists in the Chicano community. That's something we didn't really see much of when I was a kid, but golly, it's amazing now. That's really a distinction for San Antonio.
So maturity, I think, also just in moving past perceived differences and appreciating art and culture and embracing one another while doing it, supporting one another. Well, it was really an honor to sit down and talk to you. We've talked about things before, but rarely just one-on-one. I hope that I get a chance to talk to you again or work with you in something else. this is episode 6 in a podcast where I've got literally several dozen of people I would like to get to, but that's almost just the introductory thing, establishing a reintroduction to some people in our community. But then I think it would be great to get into some topics a little bit more deeply. But so I hope you'd be interested in coming back.
Sure, sure.
I appreciate it very much. And I encourage everybody listening to look up Mike Greenberg, check out his archives at the Express News. I'm kind of a nerd in enjoying all that, but it's great. Have you ever thought about compiling any of the writing that you've done into some sort of a
Yeah, I've
book?
thought about it, but not very deeply or extensively. As I mentioned, I'm working on a potential book now about our relationship with water.
Have you exhibited all of the photo documentary work you've done on all of the creek?
I've posted a lot of it on Facebook.
Would you see that being part of this book?
Oh yeah, definitely. The book really originated in that photography project.
Yeah.
And in the process of finding out what it was I was shooting, now I see something that looks interesting, but why is it? What's going on here? I had to do a lot of research. So then, when I posted on Facebook and I wanted to explain to viewers what it is they were looking at, I had to find out what I was shooting. So that's how the book came about.
Another thing I was came across, if you heard of Ernst Rabe?
Sure.
Yeah. So the fact that we have that collection of his photographs, and from what I read, is that he was passionate of trying to capture as much of San Antonio that he came to see when he arrived here before it was demolished and destroyed. And I just think what a gift for San Antonio to have had Ernst Rabe in our community during that time, because it does allow us to have like a grounding in where we started and what things were like, and especially today to try to connect our contemporary built environment with that earlier sense of history.
Well, a lot of my photography has been a quest to document the parts of San Antonio that still look like San Antonio. And so much of it is disappearing, and so many of the sites I've photographed are no longer there, really kind of depressing.
Well, on that note, we're going to end. So thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you for having me.